Welcome to our October All Books Considered Book Club meeting. I'm your host, Bill Nemitz, and this evening we are joined by Mary Louise Kelly, who's not only the renowned anchor of NPR's All Things Considered. In fact, you may have just heard her live an hour ago on NPR, but she's also the author of tonight's book, It Goes So Fast, The Year of No Do-Overs. Mary Louise's compelling memoir has given us tons to talk about. But before we get to that, a few thanks, as usual, are in order. First, hats off to Bull Moose and Coffee by Design for their generous support of the club. Without organizations like these, events like this would not be possible. Thank you both. I'd also want to recognize our bookstore partners, in addition to Bull Moose, where many of you obtained your copy of It Goes So Fast, thanks to Bookstacks in Bucksport, None Such Books and More in South Portland, Mockingbird Bookshop in Bath, Sherman's Maine Coast Bookshops, DDG Booksellers in Farmington, Left Bank Books in Belfast, and finally, Print in Portland. Now, at each book club event, we give away a few author-signed copies of the book. Congrats to these book club members for scoring a copy of It Goes So Fast. The winners are Ruth B., Kathy S., Melissa R., Deborah B., and Ira B. You'll be getting your signed copies. If you have a question for Mary Louise during our conversation tonight, send it over to us at fun@mainepublic.org, and I'll try to work it into the discussion. So let's get started. Mary Louise, welcome.
Bill, it is a total pleasure. Thank you for having me. This is fun.
Wow, we're glad you were able to rush over from the studio. I'm impressed that you made it home this fast.
Yes. Well, I was just with the way we divide the labor is there's two hosts on All Things Considered on any given night, and one of us is assigned late duty. So the happy news for us is that it is Elsa Chang's problem if all hell breaks loose tonight. I am all yours.
Well, especially right now with so much going on in the world, it's reassuring to know we won't be interrupted by any late breaking bulletins. That's for sure. It's been a crazy week. I want to start with kind of how you start, and that is just the genesis of this book. You'd written 2 novels prior to this. Your agent was bugging you for more work, and what turned into kind of a lament on your part as to why you can't do this right now was thrown back at you by your agent as, well, that's your book, obviously in the form of a memoir. Is this something you had considered before, or is it?
No, this was the book I absolutely had no plans to write. And in fact, as I was writing it, I'm not sure I could have told you quite what I was writing. I just knew that my agent was bugging me and saying, where's the next book? And I kept saying, I have a really busy day job, and this year of all years, I cannot write you a novel. And to push me on that, and why this year of all years? And I said, well, it's my oldest son is a senior in high school. He's about to be a senior. And I have missed so many of the field trips and the sleepovers and the soccer games. He lives for soccer, and that's what he's always, played. And I kept thinking, next year I will figure out a way to be there, because the problem is that his varsity high school soccer games unfold at 4:00 in the afternoon, and I have a conflict at 4 in the afternoon, which is it's exactly when All Things Considered goes on air. And I kept every year missing the games, and then senior year sneaked up on me, and I realized if I'm going to show up, I need to do it right now. I need to make a different choice right now. And I really was wrestling with that, but also wrestling with all the choices that had gotten us to that point. And so I'm a writer, I'm a journalist. The way I think through things is by writing about them, and I started writing it down. And I don't think I could have told you, Bill, that what I was doing was writing his senior year in real time. But that's what it ended up being, was his senior year in real time, and really trying to reckon and sit with the trade-offs that I had made, the deals that I had made with myself, and how that had felt to my family.
Well, I want to talk for just briefly about that, the whole process, because I'm wondering, as a retired journalist myself, people have often asked me about writing a book, and I actually ghost wrote a book once, and it was like a bizarre experience.
And
But
I think once a journalist, always a journalist. You don't get to hang
yes.
up that.
Oh,
call.
okay. There you go. Okay. Well, how exactly did you do this? I was wondering. Part of me wants to think that you sat down every day for X number of hours and wrote, setting aside that amount of block of time each day for it. And then the other part of me says that's absolute baloney. There's no way it could have worked. So how did you do it? Was it fits and
May I
starts?
say, yeah, I do not recommend trying to write a book at the same time as you have a job that involves anchoring a national newscast in a moment of just crazy news cycle after crazy news cycle. And when you're trying to spend the year really focusing on your kids and showing up and being a very present parent. This is not a winning combo. However, you know, our profession trains us to write fast, as you know. And so I let go very early on about trying to write something perfect. This is not a perfect book by a long stretch, but I did want to write something that felt just completely honest to me. And there's a few chapters in here that I thought, am I really about to put this out in the world? But do I need to? There were chapters that I wrote that you will never read, that did not see the light of day, either because I or my sons, who had a vote in this, by the way, who read the chapters that they feature prominently in and had veto power over stuff that they were like, no, Mom, you really don't need to tell that story. And put that out in the world. But my process involved getting very comfortable with imperfection and with stealing the moments where you can. We all know, you know, whatever thing we are doing that occupies our days, there's never enough hours in the day for any of us. There just aren't to do all the things you want to do. And yet somehow the thing you really wanted to do that day gets done. And this book became the thing I really wanted to do. And hosting All Things Considered is a deadline that just, you know, whether there's news happening or not, whether I feel like getting up and having an inspired idea about how to cover it or not, we got to get the show on the air. But this book became the thing that I wanted to find the time to do. And so I would write a sentence while standing in the checkout line at the grocery store, or while driving carpool, or while commuting to NPR, or while standing in the shower. And then I would get down and write it, you know, on a notebook before I forgot, because if I don't write it down immediately,
well,
it's
I
gone.
know the feeling. Yeah.
And it is amazing. But if you write a sentence in the shower, and a sentence when you drive to work, and a sentence when you got to pick up your kids, like, it becomes a paragraph, and then that becomes another, and somehow it becomes a chapter. And I'm not saying it's a pretty elegant chapter on the first draft, but there's something. And then you can set your alarm for 4 a.m. and wake up and look at it and think, this is absolutely the worst piece of writing ever. But maybe if I picked up with that 7th paragraph, there's something there that I
It's a starting point, right?
You at least have something to start with.
Well, I wanted to just touch back on James and Alexander, because this book really is, I mean, it covers so much ground, and we find ourselves in so many different places, and it touches on so many different relationships. But in its essence, this is an ode to your 2 sons.
The love letter to 2 sons. Yeah.
Right. And
exactly.
I just want to double back quickly. How did you broach this with them? I mean, I remember I wrote a newspaper column for 27 years, and you know, my wife and I have 5 kids between us, and it was inevitable that you're going to drag your kids into that from time to time. Like the time my daughter got yelled at by her fireman because she mishandled a suspected anthrax letter that came into her office. You know, things that really touched on what's happening in the world. But whenever I did that, obviously I had to call the child I was writing about and get his or her permission. If I was going to write a book that ultimately centered on them, I'm just wondering, how did you broach this with them? Did you say, I'm going to make you famous, or what?
No, no, but I did. I mean, let's start with that. My kids are somewhat used to being written about, from when they were too little to care or know. I've always mention them in a conversation when I'm interviewing somebody about a book on NPR and they tell me, the way kids do this, and I'll think, oh yeah, my kids just did that on Saturday. And I'll find my mouth is saying, the words are coming out, oh yeah, my kids just did that on Saturday. So they have always been used to me talking about them. That said, they are children. They're both, since I started writing this, have turned 18. But when I started, they were not. And I was very aware that I can tell my story, but I'm also telling their story, and they really do get veto power. So we had some really interesting conversations in the house. That, as I say, there are stories that you will never read that would have been just great chapters, and for reasons that wouldn't have occurred to me, the boys said, can we not put that out there? And I said, fine, we're done. My younger son, Alexander, who's currently a senior, has given me a stern warning that if I was thinking of writing a sequel about his senior year of high school, that is not that is not going to be welcomed. So there is no sequel to this. You'll never know how his senior year unfolded.
Oh, okay.
But I'm a reporter by training, Bill, and as I was thinking through how do I remember something and trying to write about it, I would kind of interview my kids and ask, like, what do you remember of that day that something happened? And sometimes they would remember a detail that I'd completely forgotten, and it was brilliant. Sometimes they would remember something in a really different way than I did. And at the end of the day, I kind of looked at them and said, I'm quite sure your recollection is wrong, and when you write your memoir, you can tell the story your way, but this is mine, and so this is how we're going to do it. I had one moment where I cornered James, my oldest, it was his senior year that I was working my way through, and I cornered him in the hallway, just the hallway right outside this room here, which is outside his bedroom, and I asked him what essentially is the central question of the book. Was there a time when you really needed me and I didn't come because I was working? And he looked at me and then looked down at his shoes for a really long time, and I was convinced he was about to totally let me have it. And he finally said, I'm sure there were, Mom, but I can't really remember. And could I have $15 for Chipotle? I felt this just wash of relief, one of those rare moments you get as your parent where you think, okay, maybe I'm doing all right. If that's the worst, like if that is the only reparation required for whatever I have, scars I have inflicted on you, we're doing okay.
Kind of a blanket absolution there. I was by I thought you were going to talk about the time he called you with COVID. While you're in the middle, I forget exactly what story it was, but you had a 4-minute break to deal with this parental crisis.
I was in the middle of live coverage of the day that Russia invaded Ukraine.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And stations, including yours, I hope, had, stations coast to coast had interrupted their coverage to carry NPR breaking news live coverage, and I was anchoring from this exact chair, this room where I'm sitting with you now, because everyone still had COVID, and we were in the middle of, I can't remember, the Omicron wave, maybe. But yeah, February of last year, and I'm in the middle of anchoring live coverage, and Biden is live at the White House describing troop movements and what the U.S. is prepared to do to support NATO and Ukraine. And my phone, I can see that my cell phone, which was sitting right here, that it keeps lighting up with incoming calls from my son, who's supposed to be at school in class. So this is weird in the middle of a weekday. And it's James calling to tell me that he has COVID, but I didn't know that. And I hit my cough button in the middle of live coverage, which means my mic is cut so that I could take the call. And I kind of talked to him for about 30 seconds and said, I'm really sorry. Take every book you have in your locker, bring it home, come home, we'll figure it out. And released my cough button and went back to telling you this is live coverage from NPR News in Washington of Russia has just invaded Ukraine. So yeah, one of those days.
Without missing a beat. One other thing that struck me with your travels to Ukraine and elsewhere, when I was a newspaper columnist, I went to Iraq a number of times and went to Afghanistan over there. And I remember calling my kids one Christmas morning from Mosul, and we had had a terrible week. There had been a bombing of the dining hall, and a number of people had died. It was just a horrible story. Obviously, it was leading news everywhere around the world. And I called my kids on Christmas morning, waking them up because I was so far ahead. And they were all very, very subdued. And I remember, much like your situation, I only had so much time. I just wanted to wish them Merry Christmas and all that. And it wasn't until I got back and we talked about it a little bit that it became clear to me that they were a little older than your kids. They were like in early college and at that age. But It occurred to me that in going, this was the second of what would be 5 trips over to either Iraq or Afghanistan. I tell them I was going, but what I had neglected to do wasn't so much to ask their permission, but was to ask them how they felt about it.
Yeah.
And they felt like, hey, like they never got a chance to weigh in on that. And I'm curious as to how you handled this with James and Alexander. You're going to a place where there's always the possibility you might not come home. And how did you broach that and navigate that with them?
Such a good point. Let me answer it 2 ways. One is that for me, as I've tried to navigate having a career that takes us to places like Iraq or Afghanistan, and being a mom, I've had a few rules I've tried to live by. And one of them was I don't get on a plane if I'm not very confident there's a good chance I'm coming home. Now, you never know. In a war, you never know. But same as if when I walk outside and cross the street tonight, you never know. Things happen. But I have chosen my assignments carefully and sometimes felt cowardly about it. That other colleagues were taking greater risks to tell the story. I am not in the Middle East tonight. That's kind of killing me as a journalist. But as a mom, it's homecoming weekend this weekend, and we're in the middle of college applications with my younger son, and he's doing that on his own. But disappearing in the middle of it is, I just thought, I can't do this week. 2 weeks from now, maybe a different story, but not this week. It's senior night on the soccer team on Tuesday, and they award the moms a bouquet of flowers, and you step out on the field with your son. And NPR has asked me to get on a plane to Jerusalem, and I've thought about that and thought, I can't do that right now. So there's that. There's always going to be a war. There's always going to be something on. There will always be another journalist who can cover it, but there is nobody else who can be a mom to my kids. And I have 1 year left with my younger son at home. And so I weigh that carefully. That's what's guided me. The conversations with my kids have obviously changed as they've gotten older. I was going to Iraq and Afghanistan when those wars were in full swing, when the boys were much younger. And you explain in an age appropriate way, hopefully, why you're going and where you're going and when you'll be back. I talk about in the book about, making this pink calendar with construction paper for the 2 weeks that I was going to be on the Afghanistan-Pakistan border in the tribal areas, and letting them X out the days, and I drew little smiley faces and had pictures of me so they could count the days till I got back. I think about all that. In the last couple of years, when I've been going to places like Ukraine and Iran, and my kids are old enough to understand better what the risks are. My older son was saying, "What's the exit strategy?" I just watched the movie, which, people will remember the Ben Affleck movie where the whole thing is how do you
Oh,
get the kids out?
yeah.
How do you get it home? How do you get them on the plane?
Cargo, yeah.
And so my attitude has always been if a kid is old enough to ask the question, they deserve a real answer. And I've talked to them about stuff that I'm sure would raise the eyebrows of some other parents, but that's been my approach. If I'm going to do this, they deserve to know where I'm going and why I feel the need to get on that plane. And I've turned down plenty of assignments. Yeah, I don't know. How did you handle that?
I'll subsequently the same way, just saying,
Yeah.
here are the risks. Here's why you shouldn't worry. But then again, here are the risks. Here's what I'm going to be doing. We will be going here and there. And, you just, and then try to explain that this is my life. I need to live this. And they got that. I'm going to shift gears a second and talk about you because, and I'm going to preface this question by revealing a little personal information of my own. 3 weeks ago, for the first time in my life, I was fitted with hearing aids. And I never thought, well, my wife knew I had a hearing deficit long before I did, because
usually the spouse who knows first.
She got tired of me asking what, and it turned out that on certain levels, pitches, whatever you call it, I was suffering from a severe hearing deficit. So I'm wearing them now, and I'm just getting used to them. And when I got to that chapter, my eyes almost fell out. I thought I wasn't aware of your hearing deficit before then, and so I read that chapter with particular interest. A reader by the name of Anne also did, and she asks, "I'm interested in your hearing loss journey." She wants to know if you considered a cochlear implant. I don't even know if that's in the cards, but she also says you're doing so well now. We wouldn't have known about your hearing loss if it wasn't in the book. So I'm fascinated, absolutely fascinated by the fact that somebody who chose a profession that is pretty much 100% audio would go into it knowing that this hurdle existed. Can you talk about that? Did you ever think, oh my God, I can't be in radio? And
so
talk about the progression.
I didn't go into it knowing about this. My hearing was fine, was normal as far as I know in my 20s and 30s. I was diagnosed 10 years ago. I'm in my early 50s now. And when I was in my early 40s, it just seemed like everyone mumbled all the time. And I went to, it became undeniable at a book event, and not entirely dissimilar to this. It was a in real life one, speaking, and there was a decent sized audience and people were asking questions, and I couldn't hear a single one of them. And what made me think I have to do something was the fact that everyone else in the room clearly could hear the questions. I couldn't. In the taxi on the way home from that, just was so humiliated and exhausted, and thought, okay, I need to fix this. How does this work? I think I was 41, 42, and I went and got a full exam by an audiologist and was diagnosed with severe to profound hearing loss in both ears. So yeah, I'm talking to you tonight wearing hearing aids and would not be able to hear a single thing that you're saying. I would, without hearing aids, with the volume on my laptop absolutely cranked, I would be able to detect that you're speaking. And I can see your lips, which is incredibly helpful, but I would not know what language you were speaking or be able to make out a single word. And it's in a very unfair and sexist way. It is harder with women because my hearing loss, as is common, is more pronounced at higher frequencies. Women tend to have higher pitched voices. I find women harder to hear. My hearing workup, I don't know how it compares to yours, but they do this whole battery of tests. And as long as I can see your lips move and I have some idea of the context of what we're talking about, we're here tonight talking about my book. I kind of have the gist of where we're going. I can follow. But they do a hearing test where the audiologist would say a word, stoplight, park bench, baseball, and ask you to repeat the word that you heard. And the first time we did it, I believe I got 70%. And I thought, well, that's not great, obviously, but it's not severe to profound hearing loss. Like, come on. And then he repeated the test and he did it like this,
Mm.
with a piece of paper in front of his mouth, so I couldn't hear his lips. And I missed, I can't remember the exact number, but almost all of it. Like, I was catching nothing if it was just a single isolated word with no context and I couldn't read your lips, which I didn't even realize I'd learned how to do. So I got fitted with hearing aids and was quite nervous about how that would work in a job that is completely and utterly premised on asking someone a question and then being able to hear the answer so that I can follow up. And I will say, so far, knocking on something wooden, so far so good. In the studio where I anchored All Things Considered tonight, I wear big professional Sony headphones, and I can crank them loud as I need, and I can hear, and it works. In the field, it is tougher. I'm not wearing headphones. During COVID, it was an absolute nightmare because everyone was wearing a mask. I couldn't hear you. Like, your words were being muffled, and I couldn't see your lips, and I couldn't lean in and get close and tell you to talk louder, because all of those things,
Right.
we're supposed to keep 6 feet of, social distancing and not be yelling and spitting on each other by accident. So all COVID was a challenge. But so far, I have to do my job in slightly different ways than some of my colleagues. The way I do an interview from home is different from the way Ari Shapiro does it, because they're working with my hearing aids, and it creates a little extra work for my staff. And I feel badly about that, but also feel like finding ways to work with people who have to work a little bit differently is part of the job. And I am really happy you asked, and happy to talk about this. We had an intern not so long ago at NPR on the national desk who is profoundly deaf, and told me that she'd never thought about applying for an internship at NPR until she heard me talk about it and write about it, and then thought, well, if she can do it, I'll try. And she was terrific, and she now works as a journalist. And I am incredibly proud of that, because my MO has been, you know what, keep doing it. Find a way. There's always a way. If you're doing something you love that feels meaningful, to keep doing it. So that's my plan. We'll see how far it gets me.
Well, speaking of interviews, you write about, this is something I've always believed fervently. I was, again, thrilled to see this in your book. You write about the importance of the question, why? And I'd like you to talk a little bit about why is so important, not just for journalists, but for everyone. It's a powerful question. It's a powerful word. Why so?
Excellent question. Excellent way to work why into your own question. As I've gotten more experience interviewing, I have found my scripts and the number of questions I go into an interview with has gotten shorter and shorter and shorter, because I'm always thinking, I have a limited amount of time with this person. What do I really want to know? What do I just really want to know? What do I want to understand? I want to understand what they think about something, how they came to that view. Somebody who comes at an issue or a position from a totally different place than I do, there's always a reason. There's always something informing why they think the way they think. Sometimes they haven't thought it through themselves, and you'll get somebody who's giving you their talking points. And if you just step in and say, okay, you think this should be banned, why? There'll be a pause, and you realize they're trying to figure out what they think in real time. So I find that it's a very simple question, but that often gets you much deeper than the super smart sounding, incredibly complicated, detailed follow-up. Just to ask somebody, okay, why?
You did it tonight when you asked one of your reporters, which is a question nobody takes the time to ask, is why didn't Donald Trump just give the documents back? Why did he want to keep them? And it's a really fundamental question behind that whole legal case. And it was a good example.
This is key to interviewing, as you know so well. It's just, if you are approaching whoever you're speaking to with genuine curiosity and really want to hear what they have to say, that's 90% of the job. And yes, I was interviewing our correspondent Greg Allen in Florida, who'd spent the day in the courtroom where they were in court with Donald Trump's lawyers going back and forth with government prosecutors over the Mar-a-Lago classified documents case. And we're getting the play-by-play of who said what, and is this witness going to be disqualified and all the rest. And I finally just, yes, you think, okay, but sorry, why didn't he just give the documents back? Have we learned that yet, Greg? And it was a great answer. So there you
go. This leads us to the Pompeo interview. And I got to tell you, when I started reading this book, I remember thinking, I'm going to be really ticked off if she doesn't talk about the Pompeo interview. I wanted to hear your thoughts about that. I know you wrote about it for the Times shortly after the incident, and I remember following it in real time, thinking this is one of those rare times, maybe not so rare with that administration. There's a litany of journalists who have been dragged out onto the stage by either the former president or others. But it was one of those times when, Mary Louise Kelly, the news reporter, through no choice of her own, becomes Mary Louise Kelly, the newsmaker. Having been there myself, I found it anyway, to always be a very uncomfortable position to be in. What are your thoughts on that? You didn't want to say anything at first. Ultimately, you felt like you had to. What was your overall feeling throughout the whole experience?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't get into this business to be the news. I got into it to report the news. And it is a very surreal position to find yourself in, to watch as the President of the United States at the White House praises his Secretary of State for doing a good job on you.
For calling you a liar.
Yeah. The 30-second version, for those who are not familiar with this interview we were talking about, during the Trump administration, Mike Pompeo was the Secretary of State, and I did an interview with him in January of 2020, in which I was given 10 minutes with him at the State Department and focused most of those minutes on Iran, because January of 2020, to remind people, was when the US and Iran nearly went to war. The US had just assassinated General Soleimani, a senior military commander and revered figure in Iran, and Iran was threatening retaliation. We didn't know what form that would take, and President Trump was threatening missile strikes. And I went to Tehran that month and was reporting from there on the funeral of General Qasem Soleimani, and interviewed Pompeo's counterpart, the Iranian foreign minister. And while I was there, got a note from the State Department that they would grant the longstanding interview request I had. So we talked about Iran, but that month was also, we were in the middle of the Senate impeachment trial of Donald Trump over matters to do with Ukraine. And Marie Yovanovitch and Fiona Hill and all these people who became household names in America were testifying. Many of the people testifying in the Senate impeachment trial against the President of the United States worked for Mike Pompeo. And there was just no way to sit down with him in that moment and not ask about Ukraine. So I did. He was not happy about it. The interview had been contentious from the start, and it became so contentious that they cut it short. And as my team and I were packing up to leave, I was summoned to his living room on the 7th floor of the State Department, where he screamed and swore at me for about the same amount of time as the interview had lasted, and asked if I could find Ukraine forgive my language, but to quote accurately, he asked if I could even find Ukraine on a fucking map. And when I said yes, he had his aides bring in a map of the world, unmarked, with no borders and no names, no nothing, just gray blobs of continents. And I pointed to Ukraine, and he put the map away and said, people will hear about this. And I agreed that they would, and went to our State Department booth and filed for Morning Edition. And things unfurled from there. In thinking about wanting to write about this for the book, you're right. I don't like being the story. I got a bunch of calls because that interview made global headlines. And I thought about, I want to let our journalism stand. I think our journalism was strong and the questions we asked were fair, and I don't feel the need to inject myself into this. After, it was a few days later when Trump hit the White House, he was standing with Netanyahu at the White House and praised Pompeo for doing a good job on me. And something in me just snapped, and I thought, I need to clarify a couple things about why reporters do the job we do and why we go to ask the questions we ask, and why it matters that people in positions of authority, people like the Secretary of State who are running the foreign policy of our entire country, be asked tough questions and be held to account. And that's what we do. I'm not there to ask gotcha questions. I'm not there to do map tests. I'm there to ask the questions because in a democracy, that is what journalists do. And I think the last thing I'll say on this is just, I mentioned I had been in Iran that same month and asking tough questions of Iran's foreign minister. And it will occur to any journalist listening on this call, when you're in a place that does not have a protected right of free speech or a constitution, and you ask questions that a senior official doesn't like, there may be consequences for that. And I was so grateful in that surreal moment where I'm doing a map quiz in the Secretary of State's office, and then yes, the next morning he put out a statement on State Department letterhead calling me a liar. I was so grateful for the First Amendment to live in a country where we ask tough questions of our officials and then we can air them unedited, every word. And I was so grateful to work at an organization like NPR that stood with me. Our editors, our producers, our lawyers stood with our journalism.
As well as your CEO.
And it matters. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. I want to go to another shift. I'm going to keep shifting gears on you here. I'm sorry. But we do have a question from Jen in Casco. This goes to the relationships, the other relationships that I mentioned earlier in the book. And there are many, but she says you write about your close group of girlfriends in the book who have been with you through your ups and downs. Can you talk a little bit about these friendships and how important good friendships are in life?
Oh my goodness, where to start and where to end? Thank you for a great question. I am fortunate to have had many close and meaningful friendships in my life. And in the book, I chose to write a chapter about what I call the Fawns. We call each other the Fawns, F-O-N-S, for forces of nature, who are my college roommates. And I say that with a little asterisk because we weren't actually college roommates, but it's just the most succinct way of explaining the closeness of the relationship. They are all women. There are 11 of us. We all graduated from the same college in the same year, although we didn't even all live in the same dorms. We were close then. We have become so much closer because, God, the things that life will throw at you in the 30 years since we've now graduated. We've lived through engagements and marriages and divorces and kids and jobs and losing parents and, you name it. And I've always, as I've thought about the closeness of this group, I think we were so fortunate. We graduated from college in 1993. I didn't have an email account in 1993, and I didn't have a cell phone. And I think about, had we graduated even 5 years earlier, how easy it would have been to lose touch, because writing letters is hard. But all of that came right after. We were all getting laptops, we were all getting email accounts, and suddenly it became as easy to continue the nonstop conversation we'd had when we, all lived and were eating in the dining hall together. You could do that. And people would, you could text, you could call people on their cells, and the communication became so much easier. So I held up my phone. I've got the Fawn group chat, which is like lit up every day. Today, one of my college roommates is a Justice Department prosecutor, and she's been at trial on one of the January 6th cases, and she just got a conviction, and she won the case. Guilty on all counts, and so people have been congratulating her for wielding the sort of justice on all of our behalfs. That was today's text chain. Yesterday was something else. It's nonstop, and I don't really have words, and I say that as someone who is either on the radio speaking or writing books for a living, but I don't really have words for how much they've meant to me. I write in the book about how I know any one of them, if I called and said, I need you, would drop everything they have going on in their own life and get on a plane. And I can say that with confidence because they've done it. Mm-hmm. I've had a couple of tough moments in recent years, and I'm thinking of one of them in particular who called and, how are you? And I said, I'm fine. And she heard something in my voice. This is one who lives in Boston. I'm in Washington. And she said, while you've been talking, I have been researching flights, and there's one that I could get on in an hour that would get me to you for dinner. Do you want to have dinner? And then I can stay at your house, and then I'll fly back and I can be at my desk at 9 a.m. And I said, yes, actually. I really need that.
That's a friend.
I really need that. It's a good friend. And they've showed up for me in all kinds of ways. And it's just a total honor and privilege to think about paying that forward and doing the same.
I'm playing golf tomorrow with my two best friends. We've known each other since we were 13. We went to high school together and have stayed in touch ever since. So I know what you mean. I mean, there are some bonds that are truly for life. I want to talk about another very important relationship in your life, and that is with your father, Jim Kelly. I was fascinated by how he came and went throughout the book. I went back and checked. You devoted all or part of 3 chapters to him, and I was most struck by the shortest one, the one you called "We're Nearly Home," where you start to write about your dad's past, his illness and his passing. And then rather abruptly you stop because, as you put it, quote, the tears come easily, but the words do not. And then you return to his death later in the book and recall it in heartbreaking detail, the final days of his life, your final visit to the cabin in Georgia. Tell us about your feelings for your father are palpable. What I'm curious about is how you went through incorporating it into the book. For example, when you wrote the chapter and then said, oh my God, I can't write about it right now, I'll write about it later. Yet that stayed in the book. Why was that? Why didn't you just say, okay, I'll delete that and just wait until I'm capable of doing it? What prompted you to leave that in?
So I did write this book in real time, which is kind of a scary thing to do, because you think, what if like March and April are really boring? Like there's going to be some slow chapters, but I'm all in at this point. I was writing a book about being a mom and trying to balance that, juggle that with work that I love and am committed to, as I hope is clear. But when you're writing about your kids and the love and loyalty you feel to them and what you hope to pass on to them, what you hope when you're trying to teach them life lessons and you think, are they listening to any of this, or are they just waiting for me to zip it so they can go back and hang with their friends? As you write about those things, you're also reflecting about what has been passed on to you, the wisdom that comes down the generations. That it's a ladder up and down. And I lost my dad in this same period, and it was impossible to write a book that wasn't reflecting on what he's given me, as I was reflecting on what I was trying to give to my kids. And as anyone listening and watching this knows, grief is, even when you know it's coming, and with my dad, we knew it was coming. He was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and then he hung on and fought it for 17 years.
Oh my goodness.
So we knew it was coming. But you still go through all the stages of sadness and anger and denial and hope and repeat. And it was so hard to try to capture what I felt when we'd lost him. The very short chapter you just referenced was one that I wrote. It was some months after he died, and so the very rawness of the grief that made me just not want to get out of bed in the morning. That was, the first few weeks that had passed. But I wrote about a moment. I was going to get my hair cut, which I need again today. But it was the pandemic, and I hadn't gotten my hair cut in a while, and I had gray roots popping up everywhere. And I went to my hair salon and finally was like, okay, give me your best work here. We need it. And I was not expecting to be thinking about or missing my dad in that moment. He'd never been in my hair salon. There was no reason to think about him. And as the hairdresser was running his hands through my hair and talking through what our options were, I just started to weep. And it took me a moment to realize why, which was that it had been so long since I'd gotten my hair cut that the last time my dad had looked at me, he'd seen this hair, like this hair. And as I'm talking about how are we going to cover my gray roots, I was thinking, God, Dad's never going to see me going gray. Life carries on, and I'm getting older, and Dad is not here. And I just sat in the chair at my hair salon and wept and thought, I need to write about my dad, and I can't do it yet. I just can't do it yet. It's more raw than I realized. And I sat and wrote that very short, it's just a couple of pages, chapter about sitting in the chair. And I think part of it was, I felt it. It was real. I said to you earlier, I wanted to write a book that, while imperfect, because I am imperfect, felt honest. And I thought, I can't be the only person who has had grief sneak up and stab you in the heart when you were least expecting. And maybe if I share this moment, it provides a tiny bit of comfort or solidarity for somebody else who's wrestled with this too. And also, frankly, just the practical matter of, I think I probably owed my editor a chapter that week.
Well, you got your editor.
The short bit that I'd managed to come up with, and then say, what? I just can't write this right now. Here you go.
We're running out of time. I'm afraid we're running out of time, but I do have to ask one or two more questions. One of which is on a lighter note, I guess, because it's about Ukraine. But I have become absolutely fixated on Nifanya the guinea pig. I couldn't pronounce it correctly. But it was, you find humor in the most unlikely places. And the fact that this also goes, I think, to a very essential part of your reporting. And that is, you go into a situation where 100 journalists go into a situation, and probably you're going to end up literally with 100 different stories based on the 100 different sets of questions that they ask, which are based on their own life experiences. You go in and you meet this woman, Hannah, and she is a high-profile individual in Ukraine, which is why you're talking to her. She's very active politically and whatnot, and then you take the time to get into a conversation with her, first about her daughter, mother to mother, and then ultimately about the fact that she, after many pleadings from her daughter, she finally caved and got a guinea pig.
Pet guinea pig.
And a what?
A pet guinea pig. Yes, go on.
Nafanya, the guinea pig, becomes world famous. You know, I mean, there's a butcher in Buffalo making sausages named after this little thing. I've always believed that you can't go wrong with animals. There's one thing journalists learn after a while is if there's an animal in your story, it's gold, especially. Yeah. But talk about that aspect of your reporting and how, you know, questions that some journalists might think are superfluous or silly or not pertinent to the story ultimately become the story, and they become the thing that people remember about a story.
I land as a reporter in a place like Ukraine, and when I first met Hannah, it was a couple of weeks before Russia invaded. It was the beginning of February 2022. And I'm trying to figure out, how do I report, how do I tell this story so that Americans back here listening care, can remotely relate? Because how do you relate to living in a city like Kyiv, where you've got Russian troops massed on the border and they're about to invade your country, and you're packing a go bag and trying to figure out, how am I going to evacuate my family to safety when everything I know might be about to be obliterated, and I might be about to have to take up like weapons, arms to defend my country. Like, that's hard to relate to if you're living a comfortable life in Yarmouth. But when that same person tells you, I'm trying to think through how to evacuate, and oh my God, how am I going to evacuate a rodent? Like this guinea pig with this cage and its pellets and the food and like, I've got enough on my mind trying to take care of my parents, my daughter, my kid. Like, the guinea pig, that was the thing that got Hannah Hopko just crying when I interviewed her. And as a mom, I sat there and thought, you know, there's not a parent on this planet who couldn't relate to, what am I going to do with the damn pet? Like, how am I going to deal with that when Russian tanks roll across the border? And there are those moments, as you know, you're sitting doing an interview and you're talking about NATO and sanctions and weaponry and how the EU fits into all of this. And then somebody says something so human, and you think, that's the story. And I will say, because this speaks to the heart of the book, this is why it matters to have mothers in war zones covering wars, because I can guarantee you that 20-year-old, 30-year-old Mary Louise would never have followed on the guinea pig line of questioning. I would have thought, who cares about some random, when we're watching a continent's armies on the move? This is like frivolous. Who cares? The mom in me gets, that's the story, how it impacts her daughter, this 11-year-old who's begged for a guinea pig for forever. How are you going to get that guinea pig out? That's the story. That's the story that Americans listening back home will be like, okay, I can relate to that. And I will say, to this day, whenever there's a major development in Ukraine, I have people tweeting at me and writing me and emailing me saying, okay, yeah, but is the guinea pig okay? So I would like to put everyone's mind at ease. Nafanya is fine, and they've now adopted a.
I'm so relieved.
On that end, all is well.
Okay, you took that question right out of my mouth. That's good news. I'm going to end with a question from Bill from Belfast, which is actually kind of forward-looking. You talk about how you feel like you missed out on things with your kids as they were growing up. Now that they are grown or near, well, grown, but getting into their adult lives, and you've had time to reflect on what was. What are some of the milestones you're looking forward to in this new season of your life, both with your kids and on your own? And I would add to Bill's question, when James, or if, I hope when, James or Alexander have a child or children of their own, and you're a grandmother, what are your What are your words of
Not
advice?
yet, please. Give me 3.
Okay, that's
Not
right.
yet.
They still have
Yeah.
hope. What are your words of advice going to be to them about parenting?
Oh, goodness. I don't know. I have obviously wrestled with and thought about and cared about this so deeply that I wrote a whole book about it. And yet I feel like I don't know. There's no grand answer to this. Not a single one of us has figured out how to have more than 24 hours a day, or how to be on the plane to the Middle East while you're home, making sure that there's a corsage for the homecoming dance this weekend. You cannot be in 2 places at once. I'm not quite at the end of it. As I say, we're living through high school senior year right now. But I think, one thing that's become clear to me is I was doing better than I thought.
Mhm.
It's so easy to beat yourself up for the inability to do the impossible, to be in 2 places at once. And my kids are fine. I know how lucky I am to be able to say that. They were always kind of fine. They would probably be fine if I weren't here to help figure out the corsage situation for the homecoming dance this weekend. I'm the one who cares and who doesn't want to miss these things. And it's been an important realization because it allows me to let a lot of the guilt go. Like, I still am not going to be able to show up in all the places for all the people at all this, at the same time, and all in the ways that I would like to be able to do. But most of the time I was doing better than I thought, and my kids are fine. And all they want is $15 for Chipotle.
Yeah.
And so I guess if I could go back and tell myself, and maybe this then translates into the advice I would, give to the future generations, I'll try to come up with some better wisdom at some point along the way. But it's to extend the same grace, to myself, to yourself, as you try to do to other people. It's hard.
Mhm. Forgive yourself. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're all doing the very best we can with the information we have in the moment that we're in. What else can you do?
Oh, Mary Louise, we could talk all evening, but I'm afraid we've run out of time. This has been as enjoyable as reading the book was, and it was both a book that made me laugh, and I will admit several times it was a book that had me wiping tears from my eye. I've always believed as a writer that if you make yourself cry while you're writing, you're going to make other people cry too, and I think and I'm sure that you had your moments while writing this. So I thank you for that. And certainly thank you so much for joining us tonight, taking the time to meet with us, and for what I have also long believed, all of we journalists provide, and you do more than many, is a public service in times when journalism is needed more than ever. So we're all cheering you on as you go on every night at 4. And we thank you for.
Thank you. Been a total pleasure. Thank you so much.
Okay. Before we sign off, I do want to give another shout out to our sponsors, Bull Moose and Coffee by Design, for supporting this series. And looking ahead, our December book club selection is going to be This Other Eden by Pulitzer Prize winning author Paul Harding. I should note that this novel, which is based on the real life story of Malaga Island here in Maine, is a finalist for both the National Book Award and the Booker Prize. So there'll be lots to read, lots to talk about there. We'll be chatting with Paul on Thursday, December 7th at 7 p.m. Thanks again to Mary Louise Kelly and to all of you for joining us this evening. I'm Bill Nimitz. Have a great rest of your evening.